The Executive Playbook in proud association with Hennessy XO. Each drop is an odyssey.
He became the country's youngest banking chief executive at the tender age of 36. That journey put him on a path to becoming a dynamic venture capitalist with more than 20 businesses currently under his watchful eye. Described as an innovator and a visionary, Michael Jordaan is a firm believer in the ability of technology to help close the economic divide. And also, more recently, he's also started a brand new bank with some friends. Is there any room in the world, never mind South Africa, for yet another bank, Michael Jordaan?
I actually got this wonderful message from my old chairman, G.T. Ferreira, after we had launched, and he said they were asked the same question when RMB became a bank. And then the advice they got is they said, is there room for another restaurant? And the answer is probably not for just another restaurant, but for a really great one, there's always place.
So you've stolen somebody else's line. And I suppose in the same way as there was no need for a Capitec when it was founded 20 years ago, nobody could see the need except the founders of Capitec saw a need, and today it is the biggest retail bank in the country. It's got 15 million customers, retail, and it's got a massive valuation. 20 years ago, nobody could see a reason as to why it needed to exist, and now you can't imagine South Africa without it.
Yes, they've done remarkably well. I think they've changed the face of banking. They've made banking far more affordable for many people, and they've kept the competitors on their toes. And yet, those questions were asked when they launched. And this is the same thing that happens to all startups. Sometimes people make the mistake of thinking the startup, when it first launches, that's its final state. It isn't. It's merely starting. And you can look at this, at technology like that all over the world. When the telephone was invented, its range was 1 to 2 miles. So people laughed at it and they said, what is the application of that? But you make the mistake of thinking that the first evolution is the final evolution, and it never is.
I recall a quote, and I wish I could remember the name of the company or the person who said it, but there's only a market for 5 personal computers in the world, said the long dead chairman of a company that no longer exists. And that's the point, is I don't know if we've really come to terms yet with the magnitude of what is happening in the world, courtesy of the way in which technology is shifting.
So one of the things I've learned as a venture capitalist is not to immediately go on the conservative and say it won't work because of 1, 2, and 3 reasons, but to start dreaming and saying, but what if it would work? How could the world change? And the other advantage of being in the venture capital game is you allow yourself some failures. If you make 10 investments and 5 of them don't work, but the other 5 are such that they compensate for it, that's absolutely fine. So the moment you have a little bit of that risk tolerance and you allow for failure, it's actually quite amazing what can be achieved.
But this has been a very careful and deliberate process. I mean, a very smart group of people had left First National Bank, where you had been chief executive, and a guy called Yatin Nasai and you have a glass or two of wine, and you discussed the possibility of how banking is changing and how you could capitalize on that.
Yes, so basically, it's true. We had a couple of glasses of wine and really just reminisced about what one could really do if you didn't have 2 things. And those 2 things, if you didn't have legacy technology, banks are tech companies, but a lot of their technology is decades old. And the second one, and maybe the more important one, if you didn't have a legacy business model. In other words, if you didn't have to derive your fees and your margins from practices which would be tough to defend if you started a new venture from first principles. And basically, through that process of enjoying the good wine and having this philosophical discussion, we said that there's open source technology available today, and open source is proven but free. And secondly, that we think banking could be free. And that's what blockchain has introduced to the world, or many other new banks in the world work like that. There's no reason why a blip of information, which is a transfer payment to you or from you to me, needs to cost anything. And that's why we started a mobile bank. We called it Bank Zero because so much of what it does is free, and we did it with open source technology, which made it free for us to do so.
But it took 7 years to build. I mean, and you don't have a single branch. You don't have a single building. I mean, you rent office space. Well, they rent office space. You're not involved on a day-to-day basis. Why does it take so long to do?
Well, I think there's a story that I hope will be told if it is successful one day, which of course we're working very hard at doing, to take something from idea into a proper business plan, and then to go through a legal regulatory licensing process, which was very rigid, very tough, and therefore I take my hats off to the regulators. It should be like that because not everybody should be able to enter banking. So that took some time, and then assembling a small team on a shoestring budget. And again, I think that's a very positive story that you can do something like this if you get the right group of people. That's what changes the world, a small group of competent people with a dream. And then not just buying something off the shelf. I mean, that was always an option, buy your software off the shelf, but then it costs money, you can't have zero fees, and maybe the most importantly in that facet, you can't just innovate because your technology is owned by somebody else. So it took longer to do it properly, took longer to do it on a lean basis. But now we think we've set up a platform which is going to allow for a lot of innovation in the future still, which is why what you see of Bank Zero now, as exciting as it is merely the beginning.
What is the reason for its existence? Because every business needs a reason to exist. You need permission, if you like, to exist. What's your permission?
Look, I'm going to use a big word, which is democratization of finance. But maybe, saying that in more ordinary terms, is we really believe that finance banking is too expensive for most South Africans. They pay more in fees than they need to pay. They could be paying zero. And this is not only for individuals, it's maybe more importantly for businesses. Business banking in South Africa is not as competitive as it should be. Businesses pay when they swipe their cards, when they pay electronic transfers, when there are debit orders, and all of that can be free. And we think if we can make the business sector more competitive, that's good for the South African economy. So there really was a dream by the founders to say we can do banking not just a little bit better, but significantly better, and there are billions and billions of rands that South African consumers and South African businesses can save. That driving force is nearly more important than it was the profit incentive for this group. Clearly, we want a sustainable business, but if you can change the economy and you can change society and have this positive impact, that's a wonderful thing that can bring a team together.
There was a billboard and you'll remember a startup called 2020. It was started by a former dentist. He loves being reminded that he was a dentist, a guy called Christo Darvel, very bright guy, very smart on technology. He started 2020. He needed a banking license, so he piggybacked off Sambo. And they were really making a dent in the banking universe at the time. And they were an online-only bank in the days where internet banking was a foreign concept. And they ran a billboard quoting Bill Gates saying, banking is necessary, banks are not. And as the CEO of FNB at the time, that riled you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You now are going full circle and going, Bill was right. Christo was right.
Well, Christo was a very charismatic guy and was particularly good at marketing. And yes, you're right, that billboard was parked right in front of my office. And we actually had a lot of fun about it afterwards because we also had ad campaigns about what they could and what they couldn't do. He certainly was ahead of his time. They were ahead of their time. I do think in retrospect, one of the mistakes they made was they had a very high cost structure. Yeah. And that is the one that we are at pains to not repeat in Bank Zero. And it's a good lesson for all startups is that the lower your cost structure is, the longer your runway, and therefore the bigger chance you have of surviving. So, yes, he was ahead of his time. Now we're doing it. You still need a banking license. Of course, the interesting thing in South Africa or in the world is that there is now this quasi-competition from cryptocurrency, which is permissionless and is global. And I think that will keep banks on their toes in future. So if you ask me, what I fear for Bank Zero, it certainly isn't the incumbent banks, although we respect them. It would be whether Google, Facebook, or Apple get into banking, or whether there will be cryptocurrency solutions that are global and are also free and are functionality rich.
And those are the great unknowns, and in terms of public adoption of these technologies as well. But what happened to 2020 is the rest of the banking sector simply upped its game. Here was this fantastic standalone online-only bank, and most of the banks, including FNB at the time, didn't really have that strong an internet presence. All they did was up the presence and that created a new level of competition. What stops the incumbents from taking you on at your own game?
Nothing. Competition is the most wonderful thing, and people will lift their games, and this is how we as a society become better and better. So if you play sport, let's say rugby, do you just want to play in the domestic competition? Do you want to play Super Rugby? Or isn't it wonderful when your national team can go onto the national stage and, you become world champion? I think there's something inherent in all of us that wants to compete and wants to become better. So I have no doubt that the existing banks will lift their game, will improve their functionality. Where I have some doubt is whether they'll be able to cut their fees as low as we are able to do. It's a tough thing, to downsize yourself to brilliance. And it's, in some cases, much easier to start with a blank sheet of paper, to start with first principles, to start with a very low cost base. I mean, there's wine surrounding us here today, but Bank Zero doesn't have a wine cellar, but most big banks have. It doesn't have an art collection. It doesn't, have an area where you can go for lunch. It is low cost, basic, frugal, and therefore the cost base is not 1% of the traditional banks, but 1% of 1%. And that's a tough thing to match when you're a big, big bank.
You have been investing in startups for more than 10 years now, and you talk about some will fail and some will succeed. But investing in a South African environment is hard. It's tough. I mean, we've been speaking to lots of people in startup and who've survived through COVID, and they've got a new lease in life and they're going again. But there's been touch and go for so many businesses in South Africa for particularly the last 18 months.
But that's part of the fun of it, right? If they ask mountaineers, why do you climb a mountain? They say, because it's there. And if you don't understand
it,
yes,
if you fall off. Yes.
And that's what we aspire to do great things. And again, not always for the profit in it, but to make the world better and to make it more competitive and to make consumers happy. So yes, it is hard, but you can make it less hard for yourself by doing more research, doing more work, speaking to the right people. And there's, again, this famous line from, I think it's the Canadian hockey player, when they asked him why he was so good, and he said, because I skate to where the puck is going. I don't kind of wait for it to get to me. So if you have a sense of what the future holds, living in the future, are we going to live in coal, we're using coal-fired power, or is it going to be solar? Are our cars going to be fuel-powered or electric? Will business be done via branches or on your smartphone? And you position yourself where the puck is going. I think you change the odds and you make it better for you. And then the other one in South Africa is you can also watch what's happening elsewhere in the world. Sometimes some of these trends are very clear and we're just a few years behind. So bet on the things, on the macro trends, bet on where the puck is going, and then suddenly it's not so hard anymore. So place your bets on something different. The things I've invested in are, in every single case, a bet on a future that I believe in because, I've done my homework, and a bet on the individuals, and a bet on the ability to execute. But it's perfectly all right to ask all these questions at the start. Will it be viable? And there are more questions than there are answers, which is why I prefer to do it with a little bit of capital that I accumulated, because it's very tough in South Africa to go out there and to amass venture capital as other countries are doing it, and to do it professionally. So I think, by the way, that is the hardest thing in South Africa now, is a shortage of capital that is directed to the venture capital sector.
What gives you the confidence, particularly sitting in the months after the huge riots that we saw that ripped apart large parts of KZN, did a huge amount of damage in Gauteng? And I mean, even you, as the eternal optimist, must have looked at this and thought, are we at a critical inflection point?
Yeah, it was a tough time, and there's no denying many of the other things in South Africa that are tough. But it is my country. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of many, many South Africans. All the ordinary South Africans I meet in the ordinary course of life are good people. They want the country to be better. They want it to be better for their kids. So you ask me, what gives me hope? Why am I doing it? And the answer is always people. I mean, I've learned somewhere in my life that the secret to life is people and the people you surround yourself with. And this is in business life as much as it is in your personal life. Surround yourself with people who give you energy. In business, surround yourself with people who are better than you, and then amazing things will happen. I've just seen that so often. So if I have one trick, it's just to surround myself with people who are better than me. Fortunately, that's quite easy, and that works in the investment world, and then life can be a lot of fun as well.
Optimism, the concept of optimism. Somebody like an Adrian Gore, who in the early stages of this crisis was talking up and speaking up and talking, being very positive about issues, was being torn apart on public platforms and stuff. Because people feel hard done by. People feel like the South Africa project is dead in the water. You don't.
I certainly need to be realistic. And there are many times where I'm frustrated, and it has everything to do with the concept of opportunity cost. In other words, where we could have been. So I firmly believe this economy can grow at 5% a year for many, many years. I firmly believe that we could have 3 million more South Africans employed in the workforce and earning good, solid salary. So yes, it is very frustrating. But you can't just get negative about it, because if you're not optimistic, you don't see a chance of a better future and doing something about it. So I think there's something to be said for being a realistic optimist, because after all, it's optimists that end up making the world better, not the pessimists.
How do we get greater capital investment into our economy? I was chatting to Jacko Marie the other day, who is the Deputy Chairman of Standard Bank, and he is now a presidential investment envoy and is now twiddling his thumbs because he doesn't really have a job at the moment post the riots, because nobody really wants to talk to us. And his view was that nobody's going to want to invest here until we start to invest back in ourselves. So many South Africans focused on getting their money out of Dodge.
He's quite right. In fact, broadly, that's an indicator for the success of economies. It's not just about the foreign investors and what they can do. First, you need to get all the locals to have confidence. And the thing about confidence, it's the cheapest form of stimulating any economy. And you do so by making decisions, economic decisions that are logical, that are rational, that are sustainable. And for about a decade, we didn't have that. I think we're getting back onto the right path. I'll just give you one example. We had problems with Eskom for a very long time, but we weren't able to solve them with the model that we have. But today, you're allowed to generate up to 100 megawatts of your own electricity in lots of little projects. That's a form of trusting the private sector to come up with a solution. We have the same example with our national airways, which has burnt billions and billions of rands over many years, but now it's got a private sector partner. We hear that our ports, which are some of the worst functioning ports in the world, but needed for exports, they may look at private sector partners. So yes, these things take much too long. It's very frustrating if you're an entrepreneur, but good things are happening and confidence is building. So I would say to South Africans out there, don't just read the media headlines, but also look at the things that are happening, and maybe more importantly, look at what you could be doing. Yes, you may be justified in pointing fingers, but what are you doing about making South Africa better? Because it's a very energizing thing to do that.
You know, it's so interesting. You talk to people and they go, you know what, I'm not going to invest in property in South Africa. I rent my house. And so all you're doing is you're paying off somebody else's bond. And they said, that's fine. And you recently, your family has recently invested in property in South Africa. We're sitting, in fact, in what was a farm shed, which is now the tasting center of a property called Plaisir de Merle. It's 900 hectares of Stellenbosch wineland property with about 300 hectares of vineyards, 350 hectares of vineyards. What on earth possessed the Jordaan family? I mean, how do you make a small fortune out of in the wine industry? You start with the big one.
Bruce, you're quite right. I just wasn't able to persuade Rose Jordaan of that fact. She was very, very passionate about this property, found it some time ago, and we decided to take it on. It was indeed a vote of confidence in South Africa, but it's also got this entrepreneurial thing where we think that we can make a success of it by renovating, by investing, by taking out aliens, by, all around us empowering entrepreneurs to ply their wares and their stores here. Wine in South Africa is excellent. In fact, we make a better quality wine than people realize in the rest of the world. And yes, I think property is significantly undervalued. So that's the other thing that you need to look at. I mean, I recently saw that, Cape Town property is about a 20th as expensive as Monaco, for example, per square meter. So we have a lot going for us. So I would say, instead of the negative narrative, rather take advantage of these things that we have in front of us. And same goes for property, as it goes for business, as it goes for the lifestyle in South Africa.
But investing in property is one thing. If you're getting a rental return on the property, that is another thing. Wine notoriously is a really, really hard business. I mean, you guys have cut your teeth, Rose has cut her teeth and learned the trade at Bartony. But at one stage you were making more money out of selling Proteas than you were making out of selling wine. Did that ever turn around?
Look, we do okay in terms of accommodation and a bit out of flowers and a bit out of olive oil and, all these other things that we try and do to make the business work. But, I mean, the only advice I would give to you, Bruce, and to whoever's listening is don't buy a wine farm, drink wine. There's exceptional value in drinking South African wine. Only buy the wine farm if you really know that you're doing it, also because it's a passionate pursuit. But certainly don't do it thinking you're going to make a top dollar return out of it.
But then what is the point?
I think it's also about the next generation. So if we take out aliens here, that's about restoring nature. And some of it is for our children, that they have a great place to live, that, maybe, hopefully one day they also fall in love with the winelands and it's some place that they want to live on. You certainly get a far bigger respect for your place in the scheme of things. That famous saying about, when's the right time to plant a tree? And the answer is 40 years ago. But the second best time is today. So you do things today that aren't just about you plant trees also for the next generation.
I mean, at the risk of being negative on this sort of stuff, but the booze bans have killed the ambitions of many people. I see Morganhoff recently was sold by Madame Cointreau of France. She sold it to another foreign investor, though.
Yes.
So there's some divestment. The Backs have sold Backsburg. There's been some change. But there still seems to be quite a lot of foreign interest in these winelands, which I find fascinating in the light of some of the more negative narratives around what's happening in South Africa.
Yes, we made some silly mistakes during the lockdown. I remember I once tweeted about something and you actually wrote an article about how unfair it was to ban online shopping because it was unfair to people who didn't have online capabilities and so on. So that was one of the silly mistakes. I mean, the other one I do think was the alcohol ban because, whether that helped in stopping to spread the virus, I've big question marks about, and yes, it hurt the industry. But I think the thing we need most now in South Africa, not just in the wine industry, is tourism. We need to find a way to make South Africa a place where people feel safe to travel again. I do think broad vaccinations is part of that answer, because that's the real thing that can get the economy going. It's not just South Africans consuming wine, but foreigners coming in here, enjoying what we have, enjoying friendly South Africans, and then hopefully drinking a lot of our wine.
And these winelands are an absolutely pivotal part of that draw card. I mean, we have many, many things going for us across the country, but these winelands are a global draw card, and that is the importance of investing in them.
They are, and people who come here and experience South Africa and experience friendly South Africans and experience that we are really world class, they will stay on our side forever. So it's really important to grow that industry. It's one of the answers to stop this terrible unemployment that we have in the country, because tourism is the one industry where one can actually help with relatively low skills. If you have the right type of attitude, to serve somebody in a restaurant or to pour wine or to work in the winelands, we can create many, many more jobs if we are more open to the world. So that's one of my answers to fixing South Africa.
Completely. I mean, you've for many years spoken about the sense of, it's not the jobs that we want to have, it's the jobs that we have and we need filled, and it's about getting that first job. There are so many global statistics which will show that if you don't have your first job by the age of 25, you're incredibly unlikely ever to work in your life. And that's not just here, it's all over the place, because that first job at 16, 18, 21, whatever it might be, is absolutely pivotal.
And we have so many problems in South Africa, but if you really sat down and you debated it, unemployment must be the number one problem, because if you can solve that, so many of the other problems would go away. And yes, you're quite right that unfortunately we don't have the very high skill levels that you would want to have. So you need to find jobs that people with relatively lower level of skills can also occupy, and you need to make it worthwhile for them so that they have the right type of living wage. And then the whole economy will start again. But I definitely think that tourism is one of the big things where South Africa has a huge competitive advantage, and we can put it to better use.
Absolutely. And the fact that, SAA taking to the skies again, whether you like the story or not, one just gets the sense. I was talking to somebody you know very well, Gidon Novik, who's become involved with SAA. And I once, when he launched Lyft, the low-cost carrier, and I said to him, you know that there are airlines that are in business rescue, and he goes, well, if you hang around with the sort of people I hang around with all the time, then you've got to be an optimist. And maybe that's the secret, is stop listening to the naysayers. Don't ignore the noise, but navigate it.
So sometimes you need to be a contrarian, not all the times, you know. Sometimes if the market has a certain trend, you need to also respect that macro trend. But as you wrote in your book, The Upside of Down, I mean, nearly all of these businesses were started by people in difficult times, and nearly all of them are contrarian in nature by some degree or another. And definitely when they started their businesses, there would have been a lot of naysayers around. So be realistic about it. But if you learn enough about something, I'm sure Gideon is going to make a success of those airlines because he knows it intimately well. And I think South Africa is still the land of opportunity. There are so many problems, and problems are but business opportunities if you find a sustainable way of solving them.
Michael Jordaan, thank you very much indeed. From Plaisir de Merle in the Cape Winelands, run, operated and instructed by Rose Jordaan. Thank you for letting us use the space. Rose Jordaan, Michael Jordaan, nice to see you. Thank you very much. And 10 points for getting the title of my book into a TV interview. The Executive Playbook in association with Hennessy XO, celebrating personal and business success.